Welcome to Two Beans in a Pod. Today we're diving into a
Yeah.
pretty big recent policy, Trump's Liberation Day tariffs.
Right.
You shared some pretty fascinating stuff with us, including excerpts from Ambassador Robert Lightthizer's book,
Okay.
No Trade is Free,
Right.
and a video clip of him discussing these tariffs.
Yeah.
And really what we want to do today is unpack the thinking behind them,
Okay.
understand the benefits, and also consider some of the downsides, all from the material that you provided.
Right. Sounds good.
So in the video from Tucker Carlson,
Yeah.
Lighthizer, he really immediately points to something he sees as a concerning trend.
He does. He does.
He talks about how even though the U.S. invented many of the foundational technologies of our modern world, like personal computers, semiconductors,
Right.
we're now producing very few of them domestically, often relying heavily on foreign-made components.
And one of the examples he uses is semiconductors.
Exactly.
U.S. semiconductor production is down to 8% globally. A very, very small number.
Yeah, and he points out the same issue really applies to critical materials like rare earth elements.
Right.
So it really does paint a kind of stark picture of industrial decline.
Did I?
He even mentions the study from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute that looked at 64 critical technologies.
Right.
He says 15 years ago, the U.S. was behind China in only 3 of them. Now, according to this study, we're behind in 57
57.
in areas like AI, robotics, quantum computing.
Yeah. Some really, really key areas.
Right.
And so he's drawing a direct line between this decline
Yeah.
and a period of hyper-globalization and these huge trade deficits.
Exactly. And the core of his argument is that this technological and manufacturing decline has had a really negative impact on the American working class.
Well, sure, for sure.
He talks about the loss of manufacturing jobs,
Yeah.
wages that stagnated for 25 years, with a brief uptick. He attributes to the Trump administration
Right.
even things like shorter lifespans and this sense of despair in many communities.
Yeah, right. He's saying all of this is a result of this failed attempt at globalization,
Yeah.
where the entire focus was on low prices and just optimizing consumption without really giving any thought to,
Right.
who was benefiting from that.
Yeah, who's producing it, where it's coming from.
Exactly.
And his book, No Trade is Free, really reinforces this perspective. He states very clearly that his goal is to challenge this conventional wisdom on trade policy
Yeah.
and really lay out the rationale and the data
Right.
that informs the Trump administration's worker-focused trade policy.
Worker-focused trade policy.
Yeah, and a central element of this is really resetting this relationship with China,
Yes.
which he really consistently frames as a major adversary.
Yeah. He uses the word adversary to describe China.
Right, and what's I found so interesting is his insistence on understanding that China operates under fundamentally different set of economic policies.
He does, he says.
And he argues for too long,
Yeah.
American policymakers have ignored or failed to account for these differences
Yes.
to America's detriment.
He even goes back and reflects on, his own upbringing in Ashtabula, Ohio,
Yeah,
as, a town
right.
that there was a manufacturing hub. And he saw, as industry moved overseas,
Right.
the impact it had on that town.
Yeah, so he really had this personal connection to the broader trends.
Yeah.
And he makes this really interesting historical point by quoting President Reagan,
Okay.
who famously distinguished between the ideal of free trade
Right.
and the often imperfect reality of trade in practice.
Yes.
And Lighthizer, he points to specific protectionist measures that Reagan himself implemented as positive examples of this more pragmatic approach.
Right. And it's really interesting because he also talks about how early on he was aware of Donald Trump's criticisms of unfair trade with Japan,
Right.
highlighting that, Trump's philosophy on using tariffs
Right.
to address trade imbalances. It wasn't something new. This was something he had been talking about for decades.
Exactly. And then we have these excerpts from the White House referring to Liberation Day.
Liberation Day.
Secretary of Labor Lori Chavez DeRemer.
Yeah.
She uses that exact phrase, saying promises made, promises kept,
Right.
which clearly frames this as a fulfillment of a campaign promise.
Right.
Then you have Secretary of Energy Chris Wright
Okay.
describing President Trump as a negotiator focused primarily on improving the cost of living for everyday Americans.
Interesting.
And Secretary of Education Linda McMahon goes even further, stating that this action sets the economy on a path toward future prosperity, implying an end to this period where the U.S. was taken advantage of in international trade.
I see. Okay.
So let's dig in now to the pros of these tariffs, as explained in the material.
All right.
Lighthizer, in the video, makes this really strong argument that a strong manufacturing sector is essential for reasons that go beyond just the economic numbers.
He does. And, one of the things he talks about is how those manufacturing jobs provide better wages and benefits than many others. And so that leads to more stable employment.
Exactly. And he even specifically mentions that 2/3 of manufacturing workers have a high school education as their highest level of attainment. So really highlighting the accessibility of these traditionally good-paying jobs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and he doesn't stop there. He talks about how manufacturing plays a crucial role in employing American engineers, around 80%.
80%, and driving private sector research and development.
Wow.
Accounting for 90% of R&D.
So they're really disproportionately contributing to these productivity gains.
Yeah.
And he goes on to argue that a strong manufacturing base isn't just about economics.
He does.
It's absolutely vital for innovation and national security.
National security is a big one for him.
It is, and it's not just military hardware. He's talking about steel automobiles, batteries, semiconductors.
Yeah, all these essential industries.
Things that are crucial for defense capabilities.
Yes.
And our ability to deter potential adversaries.
Right, and he even goes so far as to confront the idea of this post-industrial America.
Yeah, and what's his argument there?
He's arguing that the people who subscribe to that view, they don't prioritize American ownership, distribution of wealth among the working class, or technological advancement.
Yeah.
He's saying that their focus is simply on optimizing consumption.
Right, so it's where are things coming from, who's making the money.
Exactly, exactly.
And in his book, Lighthizer delves into this historical context. He points out that America went through this period of significant wealth creation starting in the early 1800s.
Right.
And he attributes a large part of that growth to what was known as the American system, which included tariffs and subsidies.
Interesting. So he's going back.
He is.
And using history to kind of bolster his argument.
He's saying, look, this worked before, why can't it work again?
Right.
And he notes that tariffs were central. During this period of almost exclusively Republican presidencies, from Lincoln all the way to FDR, this really transformative era, when the U.S. became the wealthiest nation in the world. And then he goes back to this distinction between free trade, in theory, and the reality of unfair trade practices that exist in the global marketplace.
And what are some of those unfair trade practices?
He talks about closed markets in other countries, government subsidies that give foreign companies an unfair advantage, counterfeiting of American goods, intellectual property theft.
Right, all these things.
The ways in which he says the playing field is not level.
It's not. It's not.
And he really is echoing Reagan's stance on trade.
Absolutely. A very pragmatic stance.
Right.
Not this sort of idealistic free trade at all costs.
Right.
But a very pragmatic one.
So let's turn now to some of the cons or complexities associated with these tariffs.
Right.
And it's really important to note that even Lighthizer acknowledges implementing broad tariffs is not a simple fix.
It's not. And he uses this analogy of fine motor skills.
Exactly.
It's not just a one-size-fits-all kind of...
You can't just kind of whack it with a hammer.
Exactly. And he anticipates that there's going to be a need for...
Adjustments, exclusions for certain products or industries.
Right.
And working through mistakes.
Right. He's very clear that it won't be a perfect system.
No, it's not going to be perfect.
Right out of the gate.
Right.
And he acknowledges that some disruptions are to be expected.
He does, especially for businesses and consumers who benefit from the existing arrangements.
Exactly. And he also addresses this common economic argument against tariffs, which is this concern that they inevitably lead to inflation.
Right. Classic argument.
And how does he push back on that?
Well, he points to China.
Okay.
And he notes that China was experiencing deflation, despite having significant trade barriers in place. He also mentions Germany's relatively lower inflation rate than Europe.
Interesting. And his broader point is President Trump's overall economic program, which included tax cuts, efforts to reduce government spending, deregulation, increase domestic energy production, in addition to the tariffs, was unlikely to be inflationary, and he argues could even have this anti-inflationary effect.
Interesting. Okay.
So in his book, Lighthizer goes deeper
into what he calls the limits of interdependence.
Okay.
And he challenges this argument. That increased international trade automatically leads to greater peace and stability.
Okay, so that's that argument, that free trade leads to more peace.
Right.
He's saying not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Yeah. And he brings up some interesting historical counterexamples.
Like what?
Like the American Civil War.
Oh, wow.
And the period leading up to World War I.
Interesting, because those were both periods of...
Right. And he looks at the idea that the benefits of cheaper consumer goods necessarily outweigh the economic and social costs to the working class.
Right, because if you lose your job to international competition.
Right, it doesn't matter if you can get a cheaper T-shirt.
Exactly. And then, he goes on to address this idea that you can retrain factory workers for high-tech jobs.
What does he say about that?
He's pushing back on that.
Yeah.
He's saying it's not so simple.
Right.
And, there's a dignity that comes from having, meaningful, well-paying work.
Exactly.
And that transition to a totally different type of job, it's not always feasible or desirable.
And he also refutes what he sees as this simplistic analogy of a national trade deficit being no different than paying a barber for a haircut.
Right.
And what's his argument against that?
Well, he says that, these long-term trade deficits, where a country is consistently importing more than it's exporting, have to be financed through the sale of national assets. And so that can become unsustainable.
Yeah, it's like taking on debt.
Exactly. Taking on increasing debt to fund your consumption.
Right.
And he's also very critical of free trade agreements.
He is.
FTAs.
And what's his fundamental argument there?
Well, he says they frequently result in more imports coming into the U.S. Without a corresponding increase in exports going out.
Yeah. So they're not really delivering on that promise of...
They're not. And he says that...
increased trade.
A lot of these free trade agreements have not been effective in addressing unfair trade practices.
Right.
Like currency manipulation, where countries artificially depress the value of their currency to make their exports cheaper.
Right, to give them that unfair advantage.
Exactly. And he talks about how he was considering a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom.
Okay.
And he was speaking to a bunch of CEOs.
Right.
And they couldn't identify any significant potential for new sales.
Because tariffs were already low?
Tariffs were already low.
Yeah.
And they had these established patterns.
So his point is just reducing tariffs doesn't necessarily unlock that access to foreign markets.
And the book also goes into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
Right, GDTT.
Which was the precursor to the WTO.
Right, exactly. And he's very skeptical of the WTO. He is. And why is that?
Well, he argues that by establishing the WTO and pushing the U.S. to rely on this multilateral trade litigation to resolve disputes, it weakened the leverage that U.S. policymakers had.
Right, because it used to be a one-on-one.
Exactly.
We have all this power. Now we're going through this big organization.
He has a big multilateral organization, right? And he points to the increase in the U.S. current account deficit after the creation of the WTO and the granting of permanent normal trade relations, or PNTR, to China, as evidence that this system placed American companies and workers at a disadvantage.
At a significant disadvantage.
Yeah. And he really laments the loss of American manufacturing jobs after 2000.
Yeah.
Attributing it in large part to these shifts in trade policy.
Yeah.
And then he goes into detail about his own experience as U.S. trade representative.
Okay.
And he highlights his efforts to revitalize Section 301 of the U.S. trade law.
To address China's unfair trade practices.
Right.
Saying this was the first time this legal tool had been used on such a large and comprehensive scale.
Interesting.
So just for clarity for our listeners, Section 301 is a U.S. law that allows the president to impose tariffs or other trade restrictions in response to unfair trade practices.
I see.
By foreign countries.
Okay.
And he discusses the initiatives to broaden the scope of national security considerations when it comes to export controls and to place restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States, really to safeguard America's
technological edge.
He talks about the initiation of tariffs on a wide range of Chinese goods and the subsequent often challenging negotiations to get China to commit. The structural changes on intellectual property, the end of forced technology transfer, increased access to agricultural markets, and then he brings up the USMCA.
The USMCA.
As a prime example of what he considers to be a worker-focused trade policy. And he draws this contrast between the USMCA and NAFTA, which he believes had a profoundly negative impact on the American auto industry and American workers. He says those claims about an eventual convergence of wages between the U.S. and Mexico never materialized.
They didn't.
And he points to the importance of rules of origin and labor provisions in the USMCA. So really to prevent the exploitation of lower labor costs.
To try to level the playing field a little bit.
Exactly. So this deep dive has been really fascinating.
It has.
Because it's illuminated these complex arguments that underpin Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. They're clearly rooted in these concerns about the decline of American industry, unfair trade practices, and the impact on the working class.
And that impact on the working class is a big one for Lighthizer.
It really is.
You know, he comes back to that again and again.
And while he makes this case for the necessity of these tariffs as a means of rebalancing trade, strengthening industries, he does acknowledge the challenges.
He does. He's not naive to the complexity.
And the potential for disruption.
Exactly.
So the effectiveness and long-term consequences really remain to be seen.
They do. And they are the subject of a lot of debate.
They are. So if you are enjoying this exploration and gaining a clearer understanding of these complex trade issues, please hit that like button and subscribe to Two Beans in a Pod for more in-depth analyses of important topics.
The sources you provided have given us a really good look into the thinking behind these tariffs.
And we've explored the historical context.
The historical context, for sure.
And we've considered both the benefits and the downsides. As articulated by Lighthizer and others. So from America's eroding manufacturing base, slipping leadership in these critical technologies, to the debates over inflation and trade agreement, it's clear that trade policy is incredibly intricate.
It is. It's a very, very complex issue.
And it carries these real-world consequences for all of us as consumers, as workers.
As a nation.
And this discussion really highlights some of those fundamental disagreements about the nature of globalization.
For sure.
About what a nation's economic priorities should be.
And about the role of government.
In
regulating trade.
It's that balance between free trade and protecting domestic industries.
Exactly. That's the constant tension in all of this.
So don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this deep dive
into trade policy.
Thank
you for listening to Two Beans in a Pod. If you are interested in reading Ambassador Lighthizer's book, No Trade is Free, for a more in-depth look at his perspective, please order it from the link below.